What would you do if your dream home turned into a nightmare? Imagine moving into a beautiful, upscale neighborhood, only to find out your neighbors don't want you there. They don't greet you. They don't welcome you. Instead, they watch, whisper, and slowly start to tear your life apart. That's exactly what happened to Damon Carter. But instead of running, he fought back, and his revenge was legendary. Stay tuned until the very end to see how he outsmarted them all. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If you love stories like this, subscribe to Inspiring Stories Told. Damon Carter gripped the steering wheel tightly as he turned onto Sycamore Lane, the main street of Westgate Hills. The towering iron gates behind him clanged shut, sealing him into what was supposed to be his fresh start, his dream home. After years of grinding through 12-hour workdays, launching his own software company, and making all the right financial moves, he had finally done it. He had bought a home in one of Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhoods, a place that boasted manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and homes that looked like they belonged in glossy real estate magazines. Yet, as he pulled into his driveway, something felt off. He cut the engine and sat still for a moment, rolling his shoulders, exhaling the stress of the past few months. Moving was never easy, but this was different. A feeling gnawed at the edges of his mind, something instinctual. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken. Damon's eyes flickered across the street, where a middle-aged couple stood on their porch. The man pretended to check his watch, but his gaze was locked onto Damon's car. His wife clutched her coffee mug, her lips tight, unspoken words bubbling just beneath the surface. Further down the road, an elderly woman stood behind a lace curtain, watching, not moving, just staring. No waves, no polite smiles, just silent judgment. Damon let out a short breath, brushing it off. Maybe people here just kept to themselves. Pushing open the door, he stepped out, stretching his arms. The Georgia sun bore down, warm and golden, a stark contrast to the ice-cold reception he was getting. A few moving boxes were still stacked by the garage, waiting to be brought inside. He was about to grab one when a black Lexus SUV glided down the street, slowing to a deliberate crawl in front of his house. Inside the car, a woman in her 60s with a stiff blonde bob and a pearl necklace that seemed to be strangling her neck peered at him over oversized sunglasses. Even through the dark lenses, Damon could feel the weight of her disapproval. The SUV didn't speed up until their eyes met. The knock came early the next morning, sharp and insistent, jolting Damon from his unpacking. He pulled the front door open to find her, the woman from the SUV, standing on his porch. She was elegantly dressed in an ivory blouse, pressed slacks, and a designer cardigan pinned with a gold emblem that read, HOA President. She didn't smile. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore," she announced, her voice clipped, each syllable sharpened like a blade. "President of the Westgate Hills Homeowners Association." Damon blinked, still groggy from unpacking late into the night. "Good morning," he said, offering a polite nod. Eleanor's eyes swept past him, into his home, as if she expected to find something out of place. Then, she held out a thick binder, pages stuffed so tightly that the spine strained. "These are the HOA rules and regulations," she said. Damon took the binder, flipping through pages that outlined lawn maintenance policies, mailbox specifications, exterior color codes, and dozens of other ridiculous regulations. Eleanor cleared her throat. "We like to maintain a certain standard here, Mr. Carter," she continued, her gaze flicking toward the moving truck still parked in the driveway. Damon followed her eyes, his jaw tightening. "I assume," she said, folding her arms, "that will be gone by the end of the day?" Damon stared at her, biting back the urge to tell her to get off his porch. Instead, he kept his voice even. "It'll be gone when I'm done unloading," he said. "Might take a little longer than a day." Eleanor's nose wrinkled slightly, as if she'd smelled something unpleasant. "Well," she said, her tone soaked in condescension, "it's just that we have certain guidelines. We don't want the neighborhood looking disorderly." Damon had seen the same truck parked in another driveway just yesterday. But that homeowner wasn't being told their vehicle was a problem. Instead of arguing, he simply nodded. Noted. Eleanor pursed her lips, clearly unsatisfied with his response. One last thing, she added, pulling a folded notice from her clipboard. We require proof of homeownership for all new residents. Many of our properties are highly sought after, and, well, she hesitated, then forced a tight smile. We like to be sure everything is legitimate. Damon felt his stomach tighten. You think I don't own this house? Eleanor tilted her head, her smile never reaching her eyes. Oh, it's nothing personal, dear. We just have protocols. Damon exhaled slowly, controlling the heat rising in his chest. You can check the county records, he said. The deed is public information. Eleanor's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. Well, she said, tucking the notice back into her clipboard. I'll expect a copy by the end of the week. And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away. Damon watched her go, his fists clenching at his sides. Over the next few days, the isolation thickened. When Damon took out the trash, a jogger slowed down, then turned around. At the mailbox, a woman pretended to check her phone but never looked away. Neighbors who had talked freely among themselves grew quiet when he walked by. Then came the first violation notice. Taped to his door in an official HOA envelope, it read, Unauthorized vehicle. Moving truck parked over 24 hours. Final warning before fines are issued. Damon stared at the paper, rage simmering beneath his skin. The truck had been there for just one day. Other driveways still had trucks parked in them. But only he got the warning. It didn't stop there. The next morning, another letter arrived. Lawn violation. Grass exceeding acceptable length. His grass had barely grown an inch. That night, Damon decided to take a walk. He needed fresh air, needed to clear his head. But as he approached a driveway where a small group of neighbors stood chatting, the conversation abruptly stopped. Damon didn't break stride, but he caught the sharp whisper just as he passed. We have to do something before this place turns into the next urban sprawl. His stomach coiled. His steps slowed. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw Eleanor Whitmore, standing at the center of the group. Arms crossed. Expression cold. She wasn't just some annoying HOA president. She was leading the charge against him. Damon felt something shift inside him. He had dealt with racism wrapped in fake politeness before. He had seen the veiled smiles, the coded language, the bureaucratic obstacles designed to keep people like him out. But he wasn't going anywhere. If Eleanor Whitmore thought she could push him out, she was in for a rude awakening. Damon Carter wasn't a fool. He had dealt with subtle racism before, the kind that came with fake smiles and forced politeness, the kind that hid behind bureaucratic nonsense and policy enforcement. But Westgate Hills was different. This wasn't just subtle prejudice. This was an organized attack. It started small. Another violation notice appeared in his mailbox the next morning. Trash bins must be removed within 30 minutes of pickup. Damon read it twice, his fingers tightening around the paper. 30 minutes? Who had time to monitor trash pickup schedules like a hawk? He knew for a fact that plenty of other bins stayed out well into the evening. He had seen them himself. But only he got the notice. Fine. He made a mental note to set an alarm for trash day. He wasn't going to give them any ammunition. Yet the next morning, another violation appeared. Unauthorized vehicle, suspicious presence of black sedan. Damon felt his pulse spike. His own car, the one he'd had for 3 years, was now being labeled as suspicious. His hands curled into fists. A black man in a luxury car? Was that the problem? He forced himself to breathe. Getting angry wouldn't fix anything. He needed to be smart. Then, a day later, another one. Porch light violation, excessive brightness disrupting community aesthetic. Damon let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. His porch light was the same damn fixture the last owner had used. He wasn't paranoid. This was deliberate. He decided to test a theory. That evening, he took a slow walk around the neighborhood. And there it was, identical porch lights illuminating other homes. Trash bins still sitting at curbs well past sundown. Multiple dark-colored vehicles parked overnight. But none of those homeowners had notices stapled to their doors. Only him. Damon thought things might calm down if he just complied, if he made sure there was nothing even slightly wrong with his property. But then he saw the cameras. It was subtle at first. A small black dome installed near the entrance of the neighborhood, its lens tilted directly toward his house. Another one appeared 2 streets down, pointed at his driveway. His stomach twisted. Had those cameras always been there? He had walked this neighborhood before he bought the house. He would have noticed something like that. His gut told him this was new. The next morning, as he was stepping out to grab his mail, he saw Eleanor Whitmore standing across the street, speaking with a man in a dark suit. Damon caught the words "security upgrade" before they noticed him watching. His jaw clenched. The tension in the air grew thicker with every passing day. The neighbors were no longer just watching. They were acting. One morning, Damon stepped outside and froze. A for sale sign had been planted on his front lawn. His chest tightened. The bold red letters announced, "Motivated seller. Price reduced. Call today." A message. They were telling him to leave. Damon yanked the sign out of the ground, his hands trembling with fury. He checked his phone, ready to call the real estate company listed at the bottom. But when he Googled the number, it led to nothing. A fake sign. His grip tightened on the wooden post before he hurled it onto the curb. They wanted him gone. And they weren't done. Damon was tired. He had dealt with racism before. But this level of coordinated hatred? It was draining him. But nothing prepared him for what happened that night. It was almost midnight when he heard the first thud against his house. Then another. Thwack. Something splattered against his window. Damon shot up from the couch, heart pounding. He rushed to the door and ripped it open. His stomach dropped. Eggs smeared across his front door, dripping down the glass. A car screeched down the street, laughter trailing behind it. Damon's hands curled into fists, rage boiling under his skin. He wanted to chase them, wanted to scream. But what would that accomplish? He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay in control. And then he saw it. His tires. Slashed. All 4 of them. The breath he had been holding came out in a sharp exhale. This wasn't just HOA harassment anymore. This was a threat. And it wasn't subtle. The next morning, he went straight to the HOA office. The receptionist, a thin woman with graying hair, barely looked up. "I'd like to file a formal complaint," Damon said, his voice steady but firm. She flipped a page in her binder. "About what?" Damon gritted his teeth. "Vandalism. Harassment. False violations. You name it." The woman sighed like he was wasting her time. "We don't handle criminal matters. You'll have to take that up with law enforcement." Damon stared at her. She didn't care. None of them did. That evening, Damon found a letter taped to his front door. His stomach knotted before he even opened it. In neat, almost deliberate handwriting, it read, "This neighborhood has standards. People like you should know their place." Damon's hands shook. His pulse roared in his ears. This was a direct message. A warning. A threat. Damon's hands didn't stop shaking as he dialed 911. By the time the police cruiser rolled up, he had replayed every possible outcome in his head. A white officer stepped out, gripping his belt as he approached. His badge read, "Officer Dwyer." Damon handed him the note. Dwyer skimmed it, then chuckled. Damon's stomach twisted. "What's funny?" The cop shrugged. "Just saying, maybe you should consider moving. You don't seem very welcome here." Damon felt his breath catch in his throat. The officer handed the letter back like it meant nothing. Like none of this mattered. His eyes met Damon's, and in that moment, the message was clear. No one was coming to help. Damon swallowed hard, shoving the letter into his pocket. He was on his own, but he wasn't backing down. After everything Damon has been through, the unfair violations, the vandalism, the threats, how would you feel in his shoes? Imagine working your whole life to achieve something, only to have people try to take it from you simply because of who you are. Would you fight back, or would you walk away? And here's the real question. If the police, the ones meant to protect you, are against you, who do you turn to? Damon is alone, but he's not done. What would you do next if you were him? Let me know in the comments, because this fight isn't over yet. Damon sat in his living room, the letter from the police still clutched in his hands. "Maybe you should consider moving. You don't seem very welcome here." The words echoed in his mind, fueling a rage so deep it felt like it could split him in two. They weren't just trying to make him uncomfortable. They were trying to destroy him. But he refused to be pushed out. This was his home, and he wasn't going anywhere. Or so he thought. Because the next morning, as he stepped outside to grab his mail, he found something that made his stomach drop. A thick envelope, stamped with the official Westgate Hills HOA seal. Inside was a lawsuit notice. Damon ripped the letter open, his hands trembling. Notice of violation and legal action. He scanned the first few lines, his heart pounding. The HOA was accusing him of illegally subletting his home. Subletting? Damon let out a sharp, bitter laugh. He lived alone. He had never rented out a single square foot of his home. But there it was, in black and white, an official complaint claiming that he had breached HOA rules by allowing non-owners to reside in the property. His pulse spiked with fury. They were trying to fabricate reasons to get him out. And it got worse. The notice included a fine of $5,000. If he didn't pay it immediately, the HOA would escalate it to the county, and his home could face legal seizure. His breath came out in shallow, rapid bursts. They were really doing this. And before he could even process the weight of that, his phone vibrated. A new email. From his mortgage lender. Damon tapped the screen, his stomach tightening as he read. "Dear Mr. Carter, this is an urgent notification regarding a lien placed on your property by the Westgate Hills Homeowners Association for unpaid fines. Due to the outstanding balance, your account has been frozen until further notice. If the matter is not resolved within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings may be initiated." Damon stared at the screen. His entire world tilted. A lien? He never agreed to these fines. And foreclosure? His hands were shaking. This was how they did it. They drowned people in fines, buried them in legal fees, and bled them out financially until they had no choice but to leave. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to think. He still had time. 30 days to fight it. He had no choice. But Westgate Hills wasn't done yet. Later that afternoon, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from his company's HR department. Subject: urgent. Conduct review. His hands felt ice cold as he read. An anonymous complaint had been filed against him, alleging that he had engaged in questionable business practices and unprofessional behavior that could reflect poorly on the company. There was no proof, no details, just a vague claim, enough to throw a wrench into his career. They wanted him jobless. They wanted him completely broken. And by the time he could even process that, his bank app sent a notification. Account frozen. Damon felt his chest tightening as he stared at his laptop screen. His mortgage in jeopardy. His bank account frozen. His job on the line. He rubbed his hands over his face, his breathing uneven. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, but the walls kept closing in. And then, a knock at the door. Damon's muscles tensed. He knew who it was before he even opened it. Eleanor Whitmore stood on his porch, her arms crossed, a smug smile pulling at the edges of her mouth. Beside her was another man in a suit, someone Damon had never seen before. HOA legal counsel. "Damon," Eleanor said smoothly, her voice drenched in mock sympathy. "I heard about the unfortunate situation." Damon's jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might break. "We just wanted to offer a solution." Eleanor glanced at the man beside her, who pulled a neatly folded letter from his briefcase. Damon snatched it from his hands and skimmed the contents. It was an offer. A buyout. The HOA was offering to purchase his home at a fraction of its market value. "Take it," Eleanor said, her tone eerily calm. "Walk away, and we'll drop the fines. The lawsuit. The foreclosure. Everything." Damon's breath came in short, rapid bursts. She smiled. "We both know you're not wanted here. So why keep fighting?" His hands shook. He could feel his heartbeat in his skull. And then she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Because if you don't take the offer, we'll make sure you regret staying." Damon snapped. His vision blurred. His body trembled. Everything, the constant harassment, the financial suffocation, The threats boiled over. His hand slammed against the doorframe so hard the wood rattled. Eleanor flinched. The smirk on her face vanished. For the first time, he saw it, a flicker of uncertainty. Damon's voice was low, unsteady. "You think you can break me?" Silence. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "We don't have to break you, Damon. You're already crumbling." Then she turned and walked away. The man followed. Damon stood frozen, his body shaking, the letter crumpled in his fist. He stumbled inside, his breaths coming too fast. His vision blurred. His throat burned. And then he collapsed into a chair. His body felt heavy, like it was sinking. For the first time since this war had started, he felt it, defeat. His hands ran through his hair, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. They had taken everything. His peace, his money, his job. And now they wanted his home. Tears burned behind his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. His fingers dug into the crumpled buyout letter. Eleanor thought she had won, but she didn't realize one thing. Damon wasn't done. Not yet. Damon sat in his dimly lit home office, the weight of everything that had been done to him pressing down on his chest. They thought they had won. They thought they could break him, take his home, ruin his career, bury him in financial ruin. But what they didn't know was that Damon Carter wasn't done fighting. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled, his fingers gripping his phone. If they wanted a war, they were about to get one. With a deep breath, he scrolled to a contact and pressed call. The line rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. "Joel Martinez. Who am I suing today?" Damon let out a bitter chuckle. "Not just suing. I need to destroy someone." There was a brief pause, then Joel spoke again. "Tell me everything." Joel Martinez was a legal shark, the kind of attorney who thrived on high-stakes battles and took special pleasure in dismantling corrupt organizations. Damon had used him before for business deals, but now, this was personal. Over the next 2 weeks, Joel went to work, digging into every financial record, tax filing, and HOA document connected to Westgate Hills. And what they found, it was worse than even Damon had imagined. The HOA wasn't just corrupt, it was a full-scale racket. Eleanor Whitmore had been embezzling funds for years. She had been funneling thousands of dollars from HOA fees into personal accounts, covering up the money trail with falsified maintenance costs and community improvement projects that never actually happened. And the best part? She hadn't paid her own property taxes in over 3 years. Damon sat in stunned silence as Joel placed the printed financial statements in front of him. "This is enough to bury her," Joel said, tapping the documents. "Not just get her kicked off the board. She could go to prison for this." Damon stared at the papers, his heart pounding with exhilaration. For the first time in weeks, he felt power. He wasn't just going to win. He was going to ruin her. The next phase of his plan required precision. Through a shell corporation, Damon quietly began buying properties in Westgate Hills. He didn't just want to prove a point. He wanted to own the very ground Eleanor stood on. With Joel handling the legal side, Damon purchased 5 properties in the community. Each one bought through a different entity, hidden under layers of corporate paperwork so that no one would suspect the purchases were connected. And then came the final move. Damon stared at the listing on his screen, his lips curling into a dangerous smile. 216 Westgate Lane, Eleanor Whitmore's house. She had been so focused on ruining him that she hadn't even noticed that her own home had been placed in foreclosure due to her unpaid property taxes. And just like that, he bought it. The very house of the woman who had done everything in her power to evict him. Damon clicked confirm purchase. And then, he waited. 3 days later, Damon received an official eviction notice. Eleanor had filed it herself, smug in her certainty that this would be the end of him. That same day, the final HOA meeting of the year was scheduled. Damon smiled to himself. Perfect timing. The HOA boardroom was packed. The air was thick with whispers as homeowners filled the seats, all waiting for what they assumed would be Damon Carter's public removal from the community. Eleanor sat at the head of the long table, her pearls perfectly in place, her expression dripping with self-satisfaction. As Damon entered, the room grew quiet. "Mr. Carter," Eleanor greeted, barely concealing her smirk. "I hope you've had time to review your eviction notice." Damon said nothing, slowly taking a seat. Eleanor straightened in her chair. "This board has reached a decision," she announced, her voice carrying through the room. "We will not tolerate disorder in this community. This is a place for respectable homeowners, and frankly, you have demonstrated that you do not fit that standard." A few nods from her usual supporters. Damon just sat there, expression unreadable. "So," Eleanor continued, lifting a neatly printed document, "it is with the full support of the HOA board that I, Damon, cut her off." "Actually, Eleanor, I have a few things to share first." Her smile faltered. Damon pulled a thick folder from his bag and placed it on the table. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is a full audit of the HOA's finances." Eleanor's face went rigid. Damon flipped the first page. Specifically, the funds that Eleanor Whitmore has been siphoning from the community's accounts. Gasps rippled through the room. "What?" a board member stammered. Damon continued, enjoying every second of her unraveling. "Not only has she been stealing from homeowners, but she also hasn't paid her own property taxes in years. And as of 3 days ago," he paused for effect, "I bought her house." Silence. Eleanor visibly blanched. Damon leaned back, savoring the moment. "That's right. You're looking at the new owner of 216 Westgate Lane." The room exploded. Board members flipped through the documents, others murmuring in shock. Damon kept his eyes locked on Eleanor. "So, let's talk about evictions, Eleanor." Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked like she was drowning. Damon folded his arms. "Ironic, isn't it? You've spent all this time trying to kick me out, and now you're the one who doesn't belong here." A sharp voice broke through the chaos. "We need to vote." The HOA vice president, a man who had clearly been waiting for this moment, raised his hand. "I move to immediately remove Eleanor Whitmore from her position as HOA president and to launch a full investigation into financial misconduct." "Seconded," another board member chimed in. Eleanor's breath came in short bursts. She turned to her allies, but no one met her eyes. One by one, hands went up. It was unanimous. Eleanor Whitmore was finished. The next morning, movers arrived at 216 Westgate Lane. Eleanor had no choice but to pack her things. Her humiliation was absolute. And as she loaded the last box into her car, she looked up to find Damon standing at the edge of her driveway. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then, with one final, broken sigh, she got into her car and drove away. Damon watched her go, satisfaction washing over him like a wave. He had won. He had beaten them at their own game. And as he turned back toward his house, his home, he finally felt it. Peace. Eleanor Whitmore had spent years ruling Westgate Hills with an iron grip, enforcing rules that suited her and bending others to punish those she didn't like. She had been feared, obeyed, and never questioned. Until now. Now, she was the one on the outside looking in. Now, she was the one being removed. The HOA vote had been swift and brutal. The very same board members who once followed her lead had turned their backs on her the moment they realized her power was crumbling. They weren't loyal to Eleanor. They had just feared her. But now, she was nothing. Her outraged screams had echoed through the boardroom as the decision was announced. She had threatened lawsuits, demanded recounts, tried to bargain. But the truth was undeniable. Her own fraudulent activities had been exposed. Her seized bank accounts were now evidence against her. And worst of all, her home, the very one she had tried to weaponize against Damon, was no longer hers. Because he owned it. The morning after the vote, Damon was sitting on his front porch, drinking a hot cup of coffee, savoring the fresh air, when a familiar car pulled up. A black Lexus SUV. Eleanor stepped out, her expression wild with desperation. Damon didn't move as she marched toward him, her heels clacking aggressively against the pavement. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice tight. Damon took a slow sip of his coffee, not bothering to stand. "Speak," he said simply. She clenched her fists. "I need more time." "The bank." She exhaled sharply, visibly forcing herself to soften. "Look, Damon, I understand we haven't exactly gotten along." Damon nearly laughed at the ridiculous understatement. "But," she continued, swallowing her pride, "I have lived in this home for over 30 years. I built my life here. Surely you understand that." Damon raised an eyebrow. "You built your life here?" he repeated. She nodded quickly. "Yes. Yes, exactly." He took another slow sip. "Then maybe you should have treated your neighbors better." Eleanor's face twitched. She was trying to hold back her frustration, but Damon could see it, the struggle. She had never had to beg for anything in her life. "I'm willing to buy it back," she said, lifting her chin. "For the price you paid." Damon laughed. "Eleanor, Eleanor." He shook his head, setting his cup down. "That's not how real estate works." Her jaw clenched. "How much?" she asked stiffly. He leaned forward slightly. "The market value, plus the unpaid taxes, fines, and legal fees attached to it." Her eyes widened. That's extortion," she snapped. Damon shrugged. "That's business." Her breathing was uneven now. I don't have that kind of money." Damon tilted his head. "Then I guess you'll have to move." She staggered back slightly, like she had been slapped. For the first time, Eleanor Whitmore had no power, no leverage, no authority. She was truly, completely helpless. And Damon? He wasn't going to save her. 2 weeks later, the for sale sign appeared in Eleanor's yard. The house she had ruled from like a queen, the home she had used as her fortress, was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. She had lost everything. And yet, even as she packed up her belongings, she tried to claw her way back. She went to 4 different law firms, trying to file a lawsuit against Damon. Defamation, harassment, fraud, anything. But the answer was always the same. "You don't have a case." One lawyer even laughed her out of his office. She had built an empire on fear. But fear was not the same as power. And now that people knew she was weak, no one wanted to help her. The day she finally moved out, Damon stood in his front yard, watching. She tried to avoid his gaze, but he knew she felt it. The weight of her loss. The absolute crushing reality that the man she had tried to destroy had not only survived, he had won. And she was nothing. The HOA had changed almost overnight. Without Eleanor at the helm, the ridiculous fines stopped. The selective enforcement of rules disappeared. Neighbors who had once looked through him now started nodding in acknowledgement as they passed. And one evening, as Damon was returning home from work, a voice stopped him. "Damon." He turned. It was Mr. Holloway, one of the older residents, the same man who had stood by quietly while Eleanor led her crusade against him. Damon folded his arms, waiting. Mr. Holloway shifted uncomfortably, rubbing his neck. "I guess I misjudged you." Damon let the words settle. Then, he gave a slow, deliberate smirk. "No," he said simply. "You judged me exactly how you wanted to." Mr. Holloway had no response to that. And that was fine. Damon didn't need an apology. Because at the end of the day, he was still here. And Eleanor was gone. And that was victory enough. Damon's story is more than just a battle against an oppressive HOA. It's a story about resilience, courage, and the power of refusing to be pushed out of a place where you belong. How many times have people like Damon been told, "You don't fit in," or "This isn't for you," simply because of who they are? How often are people expected to shrink themselves, to bow down, to just move on, instead of fighting back? But Damon didn't shrink. He didn't let their hate define him. He stood firm, even when the odds were stacked against him, when the fines kept piling up, when his career was attacked, when he was on the brink of losing everything. He didn't fold, and because he refused to break, he won. This is the lesson. Power isn't about controlling others. It's about knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that from you. The people who tried to destroy Damon thought their money, their connections, and their unchecked privilege would protect them. But in the end, truth, intelligence, and perseverance won. And that's something we all need to remember. No matter where you are in life, whether it's a workplace where you're undermined, a neighborhood where you're unwanted, or a system that's rigged against you, you have a choice. You can let them push you out, or you can plant your feet firmly and fight for what's yours. Damon didn't win because he was the loudest or the angriest. He won because he was the smartest. He learned their game, then beat them at it. And when he did, everything changed. The neighborhood that once shunned him couldn't ignore him anymore. The people who dismissed him as an outsider now had to accept that he wasn't going anywhere. And the ones who tried to bury him, they dug their own graves instead. But here's the real question. How many Damons are out there right now, fighting their own silent battles? How many people are being pushed out of their homes, their jobs, their rightful places in the world, simply because someone else decided they didn't belong? If you've ever felt that struggle, if you've ever had someone tell you, this isn't your place, then this story is for you. And if you're watching this right now, I want you to remember this. No one gets to decide where you belong. No one gets to tell you to leave your own life behind. If this story made you feel something, if you stood with Damon through every injustice, if you cheered when he got his revenge, show your support. Hit that like button, because every like is a message that you stand against discrimination, corruption, and injustice. And if you want more stories that expose the truth, stories about justice, resilience, and power, then make sure to subscribe to the channel. This isn't the last battle, and Damon's fight isn't the only one. We tell the stories that need to be told, the ones that remind us that we are stronger than the obstacles in front of us. Because the fight isn't just Damon's, it's all of ours. Like, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next battle. Because the truth always wins.